Welcome to the Ad Astra podcast. Today we have with us Teri Gee. Welcome. Teri is a visiting faculty at the Brigham Young University in Idaho. I hope I said that correctly.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to our podcast. Well, our invitation, and I'll let Elena speak about that, has to do with your work, with your PhD dissertation on the defense of astrology.
Strategies on defending astrology
Mhm.
that I have quoted abundantly in my PhD, and it has also quoted.
Yes.
And it is a very interesting work because you address the several strategies of defending astrology or like proving its validity throughout time. But if I understood it correctly, and this is kind of an exam for me, if I understood it correctly, you have three examples: Ptolemy, Masahala, and Roger Bacon.
Abu Mashar.
Yes, Abu Mashar. I'm sorry. I always confuse them for some reason. And although they are quite different, but both of them derive from Ptolemy. I mean, Ptolemy was the one who worked to take astrology out of the mythological frame, making it more rational. And then both the other authors would take from him and adapt to their own times and cultures. Got it right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. Very good.
Yeah, and I think also it's an excellent topic, and I think it's a topic that hasn't been developed enough because I always say this, but there's a lot of things written about the attacks on astrology and the criticism of astrology, and very, very little in the whole defense and apology of astrology that the practitioners do throughout time, throughout astrology's existence. And I think your work ends up to be one of the few extensive discussions on this topic. And I would start to ask you, how did you get into this specific topic? How did you reach this topic?
It was kind of a long route because I didn't start my grad school experience thinking I was doing astrology at all. I was actually starting out in classical astronomy because that was really what I had studied. I had a minor in classics for my bachelor's degree. And so, but when I got to the University of Toronto, after I finished my master's, and I was looking at my master's paper, and I didn't really feel like there was a whole lot I could do more with it. It felt like I had kind of done what I'd said, and that was it. And so I was looking for something else to do, and my advisor, Alex Jones, suggested that I get into looking at Islam, which I hadn't ever really studied at all. And I met Ingrid Haymeyer, who is a professor at Ryerson University in Toronto. And she began to introduce me to the study of Islam and science in Islam, which I was not familiar with. So it was something that was really intriguing to me, but I didn't want to give up all of the work I had done on classical science as well, because I'd spent so much time studying that. So what I ended up doing initially was looking at astrology as a foreign science, something that was imported into different cultures, but that didn't end up giving me the kind of the focus that I wanted. And so what I ended up doing is deciding to do case studies rather than trying to address everything on one small topic. I wanted to do 3 case studies as a way of introducing this concept of what patterns can we see in defending astrology, because as you mentioned, I found very few papers that were really dedicated to just defending astrology. Most of it was on how they attack it. And I'm like, well, we know how they attack it. There's lots of that. And I wanted to see what else there was. And so I chose the 3 I chose because Ptolemy, just because he is so influential in astronomy, but also in astrology. And then I chose Abu Mashar because of his prominence in Islam, and then Roger Bacon just because his Opus Maius is so wide-ranging and so detailed. I thought this was a great way of looking into how people in that time frame in the Middle Ages in Europe might have gone about this defense. And it had the benefit of Abu Mashar cites Ptolemy, and Roger Bacon cites both Abu Mashar and Ptolemy. And so I had this connection that was an explicit connection with all three. And so having that made it a lot easier to continue. And I considered adding in a fourth, doing Firmicus Maternus or Vettius Valens in Rome, but then I decided I wanted to keep this pattern just with Ptolemy because I didn't see much citations happening for Vettius Valens and Firmicus Maternus in the other texts. And so I thought I'd just keep it just to those three.
Yes, one of the things that it becomes very interesting in your work is that they change the argument, so to say. Although Ptolemy is more about being rational, and Abu Mashar is more about being useful. And when we come to Roger Bacon, because he's a Christian, he has to defend it from the criticism of the religion of the church. So it's more about not being dangerous. So that is something that I found very, very interesting. And it was actually very useful to me when I had to explain how astrology had to defend itself. I think one of the strong points in your work is that you're not afraid, and I find this remarkable. You're not afraid of addressing the great topic of determinism, because it's such a,
It is, yeah. It started out being a bigger part of it, and then as I was realizing what kind of a black hole that was, it became one aspect of what I was doing rather than the focus of what I was doing. Because I was thinking, if I only do this, I'm never going to finish.
Yes.
But I think you were very, very brave, because it's such a difficult topic.
It is, yes, it is. I didn't realize how difficult it was when I started, because I'm not really a philosopher, I'm a historian. And so I hadn't really got into determinism except as it was mentioned in these different texts. And so when I started working on it, I kind of got called out on, do you realize what you're doing? And I'm like, no, I don't. I don't realize.
But now it's too late.
No, it's too late. I can't give it up completely. And so what we did is we just said, okay, we won't make this the focus of what you're doing, because you can't get into all of it with everyone. And so if it's just one of the aspects, then it's not something I have to be able to completely thoroughly do. But I don't know if you noticed, there's one footnote in, I don't remember which chapter it is. There's one footnote that is like a page long all by itself. And that was my attempt to say, yes, I am familiar with how big this topic is. Now let's move on.
Exactly. It's one of those desperate citations where you say, footnotes where you say, well, we know there's a lot of things to say here. It's very complicated. We don't have time to do it. We're not talking about this, but I know what that exists.
I just want to show you that I am aware of it.
Yes. Yeah. And the thing is, it's so important, you can't not mention it. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll do what I can to at least say, I am aware of how crazy this is. And then we'll just kind of keep going. And I didn't get called out on it during my defense, thank goodness. I think my footnote was big enough that they were like, okay, she knows.
Yes, it was impressive.
I think you do make the point very well in what are you talking about? There is no doubt about that. And I think that saves you from the black hole.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, man. I had no idea what I was getting into when I started with the determinism until I'd been working on this stuff for like a year, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh. And one of my committee just said, do you realize what you're doing? No.
Yeah. For example, in my thesis, because I'm dealing with the Jesuits and it's a religious order, I cannot do anything without discussing the position of the Catholic Church, which is extremely complicated and has a millennia of history of debate around astrology. And it's more or less, it's not exactly as black hole as
a smaller black hole.
Smaller black hole.
as determinism, but it has a lesser gravitational pull, but it's still complicated.
Yes.
And you have to go around it, and you have to say a little bit about everything, summarize it as much as you can, and then let's move on.
No, but in every good black hole, as soon as you get to the event horizon, time stops, and we cannot go.
Yes.
And when we go out, 300 years have passed. It's really a big topic, and I appreciate it very much that you had made all this brave work for us, really, because
I'm glad it could help.
Really, you managed to be so concise and so quotable.
It's one of those things. Thank God someone mentioned this, so I don't have to.
We are very grateful.
Thank you. I'm glad it could help.
No, but for you it was also very, very useful, because Luis has to deal with determinism every step of the way.
I have tried to run away from it as much as I can and focus just on the side. And then there's determinism, but they don't like it.
That's like, if you're doing Christianity, you have to at least say, they don't like determinism.
and then I'm dealing with an astrology that is completely shaped on these strictures and in these Christian strictures. And at the time, while until the 15th century, they're there, but you don't really have to follow them rigidly. By my time, you have a bull, you have the index, you have the Inquisition. So things are really scanned through and very thorough. You have to be very careful with what you say and the way you say it. So everything is quite strict, and you have to navigate through that. No, but
that's one of the reasons I stopped with Roger Bacon and didn't go any later.
Yes, and you did very well, or else you'll be still writing it probably.
Very wise, very wise. And Bacon is a bit, I would say, incoherent or irregular, because he says in some places that the stars are merely signs, and then in the other, I don't remember if it is in Opus Maius or in the Secreto Secretorum, but in the other book he says that they are causes and not signs. And I don't know if he changed his mind, probably. So we should keep away from this as much as possible.
Well, one thing with Roger Bacon, at least with the Opus Maius, he wrote it so quickly. I think it's almost a foregone conclusion that he would have some things that didn't quite match up, because he had to write it, I think, in less than a year. In order to get it, and then it ended up that there was a different pope and he couldn't send it anyway. But he was basically, he kind of faked out the pope by saying, I'm almost done, and he hadn't started writing. He goes, okay, then get it to me in a few months, and say, oh, okay. And so he wrote that really fast. And I think that's probably part of the reason for some of the inconsistencies, is that he didn't have time to go back and check and make sure he was consistently saying things the same way. Because I noticed it when I was looking through his defense of astrology, that there are times when some of the stuff he's saying, you're like, are you sure this is what you meant? Sorry. But like one of the ones that really intrigued me was his reference to Moses. I can't remember. I think I put it in a later paper that I wrote that I gave at a conference. I don't think it's actually in my dissertation, but he has this whole thing about Moses where he says that the story of Aaron and Miriam criticizing Moses because he had been married to an Ethiopian woman or something in the book of Numbers. And what Roger Bacon says is that he took a gemstone and made it into a talisman under the sign of a particular star and gave it to this Ethiopian princess that he had married so she would forget they were married.
Yeah, I remember this. Yes.
And I mean, that doesn't sound like she had any choice in the matter. And so there's this, he goes through and he's like trying to make sure he's fitting in with all this doctrine. And then he takes an actual Bible story and turns it into, here is yeah, you can use astrology to make people do things.
Well, oops. And then, oops.
Yeah. And it's this little thing, and there's no commentary on it. It doesn't seem to even realize what he has said and how that contradicts other things that he says other places.
That's one of the mysteries. Sometimes these authors have that.
They seem to forget. Well, it's probably the talisman. They make them forget.
Yeah.
It makes them forget. Yes, and at a certain point, he says something like, and I'm just paraphrasing, something like, it's very good for Christianity to know astrology, because this way they can obey the will of God more completely, or something like that. The idea that astrology would actually very good for a Christian, which is well, it's kind of very interesting argument, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, he goes all the way. He's like, no, it's not just that it's useful. We should be doing it because our enemies are doing it, and if they're doing it, we need to do it too. He has a whole thing about the Antichrist using astrology, saying, so that means we need to use astrology so we can fight against them.
Yes, fighting fire with fire.
Exactly.
Yeah, and they go on and on about the Antichrist, because every time that we address something like prophecy in different centuries, they always talk about the Antichrist. So it's probably almost there, because every century we have this promise.
It's almost here.
Almost here, yes. But the Bacon, I mean, he goes all the way, as you said, and then at the same time, in other parts of the book, or in other of his works, he seems to be more restrictive, so to say. So Bacon is in itself could be like a thesis by itself.
Oh yes.
Very complex.
Yes, I think I could have done my thesis on any one of these people and still had it just as long, if not longer.
Yes.
Yeah. These are major authors with a lot to say, with these great presentations and defenses of astrology, great discussions. Yeah, so there's a lot to extract from their positions and their practices.
Yes, and also Ptolemy, because people quote Ptolemy, but and sometimes they say that older ancient astrology is very deterministic, but when we really read Ptolemy, he says that the astrological chart is one factor, and then we have to see other, such as family or condition or nation, as he says, other factors. And then he says somewhere else in Tetrabiblos that there are several levels of causality. That's one of the things. So he's quite complex, and people sometimes quote him like as if he's monolithic in his determinism, and he's not. So this is the interesting thing, I think, that even older authors, earlier authors, are very complex. We can see that they have this very complex notion of determinism and other things, but specifically determinism. They are very complex, and sometimes we don't find this in Renaissance, for instance. Well, in the good ones, yes, but then we have all this popularization of astrology, and it becomes really simplified and deterministic. And the more simplified it is, the more deterministic it
tends
is.
to be. Yes, that's true.
So that's an interesting thing. Yeah.
And then that's what was one of the things that the church was more concerned about, from what I've seen, is that they're not so much concerned with the big treatises on astrology. Those are read for people who usually know what they're talking about. And the problem is when you have almanacs and very low-grade astrology texts that have very strict things. And
the horoscope in the newspaper.
Exactly. Then you have a lot of problems. It becomes problematic.
I think it's interesting because we were, the three of us, trying to move away from determinism, and now we are being sucked again.
Here we are.
It's the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Anyway,
never leaves.
Large one,
a very large elephant. Yes, very heavy.
And after your thesis, what else did you explore on the topic of astrology? Or did you have the chance to explore a little bit more, or did you change a bit your focus of research?
So I mentioned it in the email that when we were talking first to set up this meeting, but BYU Idaho is actually a teaching university, and so since I've been a visiting faculty, I have been basically it's 4 classes. Well, it's not right now. It's not 4 classes, but because they've had to cut down everything with the pandemic. But a lot of my time is basically just doing my classes. But I did a couple of papers kind of elaborating on my chapters in my thesis. And I did some stuff with Roger Bacon and his idea of rays, the source of the influence of astrology, where the rays are actually being emitted, and we're collecting these rays, and those rays are actually physically real objects. I did a little bit more on that. And then what I've been doing, not as much as I would like, I've kind of shifted gears a little bit. And I have been doing a little bit of research on, how do I put this? On like perceptions of the night sky. So the idea of, if you take a person who lived in Ptolemy's day, so a geocentric universe, and a person who is living in a heliocentric universe, how would they describe the sky? Would they actually be seeing the same things? And this has come from, it's kind of been something that's been in the back of my mind since I started grad school. I was told it wouldn't make a good thesis topic, and so I kind of pushed it to the side. But since I've been out, I teach one history of science class here. That's it. And there's another instructor who also teaches it, and we basically kind of fight over who gets to teach that class because we both love it. And so, but when I teach it, one of the things that I talk about is the way that our perceptions change as we learn things. So like the discovery of the planet Uranus, they actually had Uranus plotted in celestial almanacs for years before it was discovered, in quotes. And it's because they thought it was a nova or it was a comet, because there can't be more planets. And so it took someone who was willing to say, no, that's behaving like a planet. That's a planet. And that just kind of started getting my mind thinking about, well, what is it that we see? I mean, how much is that affected by the beliefs that we have about astronomy? What does that really tell us? And so I started kind of gathering some ideas with this, and it's not astrology as such, but it's because astrology is also affected by the culture in which it is. It's still kind of an extension of that same idea. My main passion has been, ever since I started studying the history of science, has been studying the transfer of ideas and how they move through cultures. That's why I didn't want to stay with just one person. I wanted to see that trend of those ideas. And so this is just another way of following those ideas. I've thought about going back to some of my dissertation work. I haven't had a lot of time, unfortunately. And I don't know, I guess if my visiting faculty ends and I don't have anything else, maybe I'll have lots of time to work. But that's been the main thing, is that I've been doing I haven't had a lot of stuff that's actually been written, but I've been doing the research on it a little bit for about the last year or so. And if I can, I would like to work this into something that's actually publishable. It's just seeing where it goes and how far I can actually take this as an idea.
That's extremely interesting, because the way we perceive the sky, the way we perceive determines the way we receive the ideas about astronomy or astrology. And often we notice that people don't actually, they don't actually look at the sky. For instance, if we see the moon during the day, and sometimes we do, like now, and we point out and see, look, the moon, and people are very surprised because they say, oh, the moon is at night.
No, it's not visible today. Of course
Yeah,
it is.
I've had students who were shocked by that.
Yes.
Which tells us, and perhaps if you tell them, if you ask the same person to explain the solar system, even if in a very basic way, they will do it because that's what they learn. And we do note a cleavage between this, what people were taught in school, the heliocentric solar system, all that notion that we have in the and then the perception of the sky. If you look at it and you have the personal experience, and there's a big gap there for most people. Things don't fit because it doesn't. You cannot. It's two different points of view, and you cannot experience the one that you've learned with the one that you perceive, and I think that's a very interesting
there's this
point to explore.
Even to the point that some people don't believe, and they actually say, I don't believe that we can see the planets.
Right.
Just go outside and see, because
they are three out there right now.
Exactly.
Yeah. Venus in the morning.
And Venus in the morning.
Exactly.
So people have this, they live in, their perception tells them that this is a geocentric universe. And they were taught this is an heliocentric universe or system. They are both correct. They are just a different point of view. And so they cannot, they
haven't been taught to connect the two, I think.
Right.
But at least that's our perception. Yeah. And we, throughout the years, when we tell people, well, there are the planets, there's Venus, there's Mars.
And they are surprised, genuinely surprised. They're like, oh, but we can't see the planets, really? Like, no.
Well, are you familiar with a man by the name of Asiji?
No.
Okay, he's not very well known. We know very little about him. He's mentioned by Al-Biruni, and I read about him. I was first introduced to him by Ingrid Haymeyer, and then I read about him a little bit more in a book on, what's the title? Oh, I can't remember. It's a blue book. The cover's blue. That's all I can think of at the moment. But he basically, Al-Biruni talks about him as someone who has studied a heliocentric universe and has a armillary sphere, or I can't remember what he has. He has built some instrument that is based on the heliocentric model. And he says, but he's showing that it's mathematically equivalent for it to be either heliocentric or geocentric.
Exactly.
And it's not a big part of Al-Biruni's argument, but it seems like Al-Biruni's like, yeah, he does this, but it doesn't really matter. Because we know what it is.
Yeah.
And so he just kind of mentions it's like we just kind of mentioned it. And so like when I'm teaching my class, one of the things I make sure my students understand is that when we talk about geocentrism versus heliocentrism, we're not talking about stupid people.
Yes.
Because, did you get up this morning and go, whoa, the earth is really moving today? They're like, no, you don't feel the earth moving. Yes. You go outside and you see the sun moving.
Exactly.
And so that's one of the things that kept me going. Like, what is it that we really know? Because if you ask someone, like you said, if you ask someone to just say, what is up there when you talk about the night sky, they're going to use all the right words. But what do they really understand? And what is it that they're really perceiving from it? And I find that concept to be something really fascinating.
Yes.
Absolutely. And they perceive this as something that is detached from them, not a reality that they can experience. And also, the other thing that is very interesting is that people think, non-historians often think that when they discovered the heliocentric system, immediately astrology was destroyed and everybody stopped doing astrology. Well, these same people who were pushing the heliocentric model were actually practicing astrology, and they kept doing it because it's just a different referential. It's just a different point of view, and they are compatible. That's the interesting thing. When we look outside, when we look to the planets, we are in our geocentric perspective. And then if we are outside the solar system or looking at this drawing of the solar system, we'll be like outside looking from the outside, and it's heliocentric. they are both correct and they are both right.
Yeah.
So this is interesting because people think of them like opposing and opposites and
Mhm.
mutually exclusive, but they are not. That is also very interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't
You're going to
change.
say something?
I was thinking, there's someone who says, I think it's Campanella, who says something about that. It doesn't really matter if it's the Earth in the center or the
yes.
Sun in the center. I don't know the exact
I think it's
quotation,
Campanella.
Oh.
but I think it's Campanella.
Oh, okay, I haven't read much of Campanella. I know of him, but I haven't done much. He's too late.
Yes,
It's too
it's
late,
a bit
yes.
beyond your usual time
also,
range.
yeah. I'm also a
Yeah, but
medievalist, and I tend to live up to the 15th century.
Yeah, it's like I stop at 1300. We're done.
Yeah, yeah, but it is Campanella. I don't recall the quote, the exact
I
quotation.
remember this, yes.
But
yes.
he does say something about it. It doesn't really matter if it's the Sun at the center or the Earth at the center. The thing works in any way.
Right.
And that's quite an interesting view, because we have very little reception of these new discoveries from Galileo, because this is exactly the time I'm working. So I don't see much discussion on how does this change
Right.
the only one that I saw, but I'm also focusing in a very select number of authors, but one that I saw, which is very interesting, his description is that he thinks, I have to recall his names, I have so many people in the thesis.
Yeah.
It's a Jesuit that gets in a fight with Galileo on the matter of the sunspots.
Oh, I know who you mean, and I can't think of his name either.
I will recall his name in a moment. And then he believes that the sunspots are small celestial bodies which are orbiting near the sun. And there is another school which Galileo is with it. It's really spots on the sun. And so he is talking against astrology by saying that if you have these bodies orbiting the sun and constantly eclipsing the sun, then by the rules of astrology, their effects should be extremely powerful, because their eclipses of the sun, their conjunctions with the sun affect the entire Earth, while an eclipse of the sun by the moon only affects a part of it where it's visible. And so he says, so what we know of astrology is wrong because we're not taking into account these conjunctions, which is quite an interesting argument, because he's attacking astrology using an astrological argument, because there's something that we're not looking at. Of course, this doesn't make any sense, because these are not planets, this is something else. And then he says, but because we cannot predict this phenomenon, because the sunspots are highly regular, we cannot really do any prediction, any astrological prediction with them, because we cannot create an ephemeris of the sunspots, of these bodies. So they are useless, and they're constantly influencing and interfering with astrological judgments, but we cannot predict them, neither to the past, neither to the future. So any conclusions that we reach are completely wrong. This is fascinating, this whole argumentation.
Because he uses astrology.
He uses astrology
It's almost like he's saying, even if we follow your rules, you're still wrong.
You're still wrong, exactly. By your own rules, you're wrong, because you're not taking this into account. Which is it's a very clever argument, I must say.
It is.
It is a very intelligent argument, but it's one of the few examples that I've found of this discussion of these new findings and this change in perception coming into astrology. And there are not many, as far as I figured out, which is strange. I find it very strange. We would expect that the fact that there are suddenly other things moving there and changing there, that it should have created more of an echo into how you conceptualize astrology. And
it doesn't
there, but not in the measure that you would think, which is strange.
But there are some things that I think the astrological system is kind of elastic. For instance, the comet.
Oh yes, we have
you know
a
that
good
one.
example.
Yes.
What we gave a lecture on this when there was the 600, 400 years of the
Comet
the
of
1618 comets.
Still celebrating.
Still
the
celebrating
comet.
1618 comets. There was this conference, and we tried to explore a little bit what's the astrologer's point of view on this phenomena. And we found a very interesting discussion, which is there's this author, two Portuguese authors in this case. That's we just selected a few cases, and most of them do the predictions on the comet and the whole thing on the comet with traditional Aristotelian principles and astrological principles, and considering that it is a sublunary phenomenon. But there's another one, which is quite an avid astrologer, and he says, no, this has been more than proved that it is not a sublunary phenomenon. So the question here is, then how does it change the way you interpret the comet? Because the comet is not an astrological phenomenon because it's sublunary. It is caused by movements of the planets, but it's not in itself something that has influence or any kind of effect. It's a consequence of an effect. But if you consider that it is a celestial phenomenon, then it puts it in a completely different category.
Right.
And what he does, for our surprise, he doesn't change the interpretation. He simply adds more information. So what he says is, because this comet is found by the measurements that they do, by the parallax measurement, around the sphere of Mars, then is some sort of emanation from Mars, so it has a Martial characteristic.
And that's it.
And that's it. And the problem solved. And he goes on and does a standard
and does not
prediction
destroy
of comets. And the thing just moves and adapts the narrative to the new evidence.
The system is elastic. The system is very elastic.
Absolutely incredible.
It's a very old system.
Yeah.
Very
well, I hadn't
resilient
ever
system.
thought about the consequences of comets in a heliocentric system.
Exactly.
I had never even considered that. That's interesting.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. It's all these changes that we see going around. And so backing to your project, and I think it's fascinating. I think it is interesting to understand these changes in perception, not only throughout history, but how does it affect suddenly everything is different.
And also the other example would be when they discovered the four main satellites of Jupiter.
Yes.
And they said, wow, if everything is around Earth and moving around Earth for our benefit, so if there are four small planets around Jupiter,
that's one of the questions.
Who is benefiting from this? Is there people there? Is there someone there? So it's such an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
Oh, it is. Yeah. I love when I'm doing my history of science class teaching and showing them the pages from Galileo's observations. I actually don't care as much for the dialogue on the two world systems. It's important, but I really like his letters on sunspots and all of the diagrams that he does of the stars that he sees in the Milky Way when he first uses his telescope. Yes. I mean, those are the things I love showing, because he's like, yeah, look, and Venus looks like this. Venus goes through phases, just like Copernicus predicted it would.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just I love seeing those things, and my students can understand it better when they can see what it is that he is seeing and understanding why this is so different. And like, I have this little chart of his night by night plotting of the moons of Jupiter and where they were and how they're always only by Jupiter. So they're clearly tied to Jupiter. And so you can't argue that they're going around the Earth because they're always over here.
Yes.
And it's just so interesting to see.
Yeah.
And what is amazing is that his telescope, the head of our department always says this, the telescope that he had is much, much worse than the telescope that any child now can have. So it's really a bad telescope.
It's a terrible one.
Everything.
Yeah.
Well, he's actually probably lucky that it is, because since he was using it to look at the sun, he's probably lucky it wasn't a better one.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
That would be the end of his career.
Exactly. At least in one eye.
Yes.
Then
if
it
it's a
would-
better telescope, we had images of Galileo with the pirate, you know,
A little patch over his eye.
poor man.
Poor man, yes. Oh, but you have also this interesting example of the telescope and the vision of Venus.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
in this regard, I can send that paper because that one was published. We managed to find a paper some years ago
Also in Portugal.
in Portugal, and it's again a Jesuit who is making a report to the king on an eclipse of, let me see if I recall correct, 1656. I think an eclipse.
I'll take your word on it.
Yeah, something around that time. And he is doing a report to the prince, not to the king, but to the prince, to the prince heir. And what he does, which is quite amazing, and as far as I know, it's the only example of this kind that exists, that has been reported so far, is that he includes in his astrological interpretation of the eclipse observations of telescope. And you can, and what he does, which is, I think it's amazing, is that he's looking at the planets with all those characteristics, the Saturn with the two, the rings, which is still not identified at that period, the moons of Jupiter, and all of that. And what I think it's what later will be called the famous channels of Mars, because he's doing some lines there that he doesn't know what it is. And what he does is he doesn't see any change. So he observed them, but he doesn't see any change. But in Venus, he sees something that we're not sure exactly what he saw, but he sees something that in his perception, sort of a shadow, we think it might be an early observation of the clouds. We're not sure about this. He clearly states that it's not a problem with the telescope because he checked. He sees the shape of a cross.
Of course.
What else would it be?
Convenient, which changes
A
into
six-pointed star would be very inconvenient.
At that period, oops. And that it shifts into 5 segments, which he identifies being as the 5 shields which exist in the Portuguese flag, in the Portuguese at that period. And so from there, he incorporates that into his prediction of the eclipse as something that is interpretable, because there was a change in appearance of the planet Venus.
Interesting.
And it is quite interesting, and as far as I know, it is a unique example of this kind of and here you can see the 2 perspectives of a geocentric astrology, an observation of the eclipse, which is quite standard astrology practice, and then incorporating something that is observable only by a telescope. And the 2 are mingling in a very strange way, but it's
you can send it.
I'll send you.
Oh yes, I would love to read it.
Where was it published? Early Science and Medicine?
No. Journal of the History of
Astronomy. Journal of the History.
Okay.
In the article.
Yeah, I would love to read that. That sounds fascinating. Yeah. I've never heard of any astrological predictions using a telescope.
Yes, we didn't either, and we tried to find similar documents before publishing this paper, but nothing. No reference at all.
And speaking of perception, the other great shift would be when they navigate to the southern hemisphere and see new stars.
Yeah.
It would also be amazing for people to see completely different constellations.
Yeah. Let's see, who is it? Seneca? I think it might be Seneca. Wrote back, Rome, not talking about southern hemisphere, but talking about the other side of the earth. And he talks about what did he call them? The Antipodeans? I can't remember. He has a name for them. And he's using it as a moral argument. But he's saying, it's almost like he's talking about aliens. He says, what if there were people living on the other side of the earth? Would they get up in the middle of the night? And would they sleep during the day? I mean, he's talking about them like, what would happen if there were people living on Mars? It's those kinds of arguments that he's making. And it's so interesting because he's using it as a moral argument to say, there are people living in Rome who are living like Antipodeans might. and they're not doing anything with their time during the day because they're sleeping. But I mean, that conception of, first of all, that it's a spherical Earth, which, you know, people keep saying, oh, everyone believed the Earth was flat until Columbus.
Yeah.
I know. I'm like, no, look, here is one. He's talking specifically about people living around the curve of the Earth, and he understands that it would be dark over there when it's light over here.
Yes.
So, and he's not an astronomer. He's a philosopher. He's an ethicist, I guess you could say. And he understands that concept. And he doesn't, let's see, have I read anything about, I haven't read anything where they talk about the different stars that are available, but I mean, I'm assuming you're familiar with like astrolabes, somewhat, at least, like the use of them.
Yes.
Yes. And so, you know, they would actually have the different, latitudes, the plates that you could replace. So they knew that there would be shifts in the stars.
Yes.
And I don't know if anyone ever went far enough south, because, you know, there's the fear that they had that, you know, Mount Kilimanjaro was going to make their magnets stop working, their lodestone stop working. So they didn't sail down that far
They started to navigate quite early with the exploration of the coast of Africa. So I think from that point on, they started to understand that things are not exactly how they are. What I'm finding in already in late 16th and 17th century is a discussion of then how does this work?
Right. What does it mean?
Now we're having completely different stars. And there is one that says this in a very poetic way in a book. It says, what meaning do have these new stars, which are not in the codices of the ancient? There's nothing old that gives us tradition on this meaning. So how can we attribute meanings to something that is on the other side? It's completely different. And this is a very interesting question that they start to make in mid-16 to mid first half of the 17th century. And there's a whole discussion, how does astrology work in the Southern Hemisphere? Because suddenly everything is inverted, and the explanations of Ptolemy with the seasons reverse completely. And so what do we do? But I think this is a discussion that was stopped, because by the mid 17th century, astrology was sort of getting out of the scientific discussions. So it didn't continue long enough. But you see that coming around, and there are exchanges and discussions, and you have people practicing the South, which is quite interesting, saying, well, Campanella, I think Cardano says that we should invert the system. They propose the inversion of the system, at least theoretically, and they say, but we don't see that happening here. These are physicians using astrology in medicine. We don't see this happening here.
That's also theory and practice, because the ones who proposed the complete inversion of the system were normally Europeans, they were not. And so the ones who were actually there in the Southern Hemisphere would reply, okay, that's a very good idea, but we don't see that in practice. Yeah. So it's this also theory and practice.
And there's someone who says something like this, and I'm completely paraphrasing this, that if Ptolemy was wrong in other things, then probably his explanations for the associations of the planets with the signs through the seasons are wrong as well, and the association is made by some other explanation that we're not aware of. And this is quite interesting, because at that time they already know that Ptolemy was not correct in many of his views of what would be the other side, and there's an interesting discussion. And again, it's a problem. It's a question of perception, and how does that perception affect your reality, of how you see the cosmos, and how the cosmos works.
So I think you have a great project in your hands.
Thanks. It's like you're adding all this stuff to it. I'm like, wow, I can just make this book like 4 volumes.
You can really. I think you have
it's fascinating.
An interesting material to work with.
One of the things I always say this, it's one of the major shifts for me in my perspective. I might be wrong, but it's that the ancient world was very organized, because we have the spheres, and we knew how they were in our perspective. No, I mean, we knew that was the moon, and then Mercury and Venus, and everything was organized in the sky, in the heavens. And on Earth, there were some parts that we were not, that were unknown and scary. You know, the new continents, we were not aware of them, and the sea was, the other side of the Earth was not there. So we had this. The Earth was chaotic and unknown, and the skies were like regular and very organized. And what we have now, we know every little bit centimeter of the Earth. Sort of. Because we have, you know, we have Google Earth, and we can see everything, or almost everything except the military bases. And then instead of these concentrical spheres, the space is absolutely limitless. So this changes completely our perception. Perhaps not our perception, because we were born in this limitless universe, but for someone who had this idea that universe was concentric and kind of protective of Earth, and God was outside looking at the universe.
Heaven was just some 1,000 meters.
Yeah, above. God was just over there looking at us. And now we have all this small Earth in an infinite universe. So our perception completely changed.
Right.
Our role in the universe completely changed. And also we feel more like vulnerable, you know, to this, all this infinite. So it's a major shift. I think this is another volume. This will be the 5th.
There you go. The modern thing. Well, when I teach astronomy, one of the hardest things to get my students to understand when I teach astronomy is that there's no center to the universe. Because not having something that is like an absolute frame of reference and everything is coming out from that center, whatever it is, even if it's not us, there has to be one.
Yeah.
And so trying to explain no center, they mentally, even though they can repeat back the answers, they really don't understand. Yeah. And it's because we want there to be something that is a center. And it's even if you know what the answers are, really understanding them is much more difficult. And because I started out as an astronomy nerd. I would go out in my backyard. I didn't have a telescope, but I would just go out in my backyard and sit there and look at the sky. And when I went to college, I started studying astronomy, and I worked at the observatory on campus, and then I shifted over to a history instead, but still minored in physics. I mean, I've always had that. And so for me, I've just kind of been able to gradually add on. But when I have students who've never studied it before and are now going, okay, so here's our solar system. I'm good with that. Here are the planets. Here are stars. Here's how stars work. Here's the galaxy. Oh, wait, there's no middle of our universe. What does that mean? Because like we have a center of our solar system. There's a center of the galaxy. There's a gravitational center of our local group. Yeah. But then you get out there and like, there's no center. Like, no, there has to be one.
It's very, very far away. We cannot see
it. If there is, we can't see it.
You can't see it.
Yeah, it's very difficult to deal with all this dimension of the universe. We cannot compute.
Yeah, there's a point where you understand that it's big, but the brain doesn't process anymore.
The brain starts like, it's very big. It's very big.
It's like, it's big. Okay, we're done.
But we are also nerds and proud.
Yay!
Because we also go out and we also observe. We have a telescope, and sometimes just with our eyes. And we saw the comet lately.
Oh yes, I did too. I went out and I couldn't figure out where it was in my backyard because there are trees and bushes and stuff around, and so all of the references, all the maps I was seeing, I couldn't figure out. And so I went out and I drove out like 20 minutes out into some potato fields, and I got out of my car and I'm like, okay, where is it? And I sat there for about 20 minutes, and then finally I saw it. And after that, I could find it every time. But up to that point, I was like, I can't see it. Because it was a lot higher than I thought.
Yeah.
And it's small. We were expecting something like very spectacular.
Big, We were seeing all these pictures in the internet.
Oh, I know.
And then we did 2 or 3 attempts, I don't recall.
We had to go out of Lisbon
very early in the morning and going to something a little bit, and we couldn't see anything. I said, probably we should do it a bit early. We don't know. And then finally it started to be visible. after sunset, which is a bit more comfortable.
Yes, that's when I did it too.
Experiment, yeah.
Because
And-
we went at 4 a.m. in the morning, and I
Yes.
think we were trespassing some, I don't know.
Yeah.
We were like climbing and trying to see above the lights of the city, but still
Right.
it was very,
Yeah, it was very difficult. Even we could only see it out in the field
Out in the
at
fields.
night, and then we were searching, and then there it is, that smudge.
Yeah,
Little
little smudge.
Yeah.
I
We
have some
were,
large
we
binoculars I
don't know.
used.
Yeah.
I have some large binoculars that I used to
Oh, yeah.
observe.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
So
that was
yes,
nice.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes,
Yeah.
we went to this cape near the sea. It was very, very cold, but we were like, there.
Yeah.
And then we could see it also. So
Yeah,
it was very,
yeah.
very
And there
nice.
were people there. We had cameras connected with the proper lens.
Oh,
and
nice.
they showed us, see, there it is, and they had a better definition.
Mhm.
But yeah, nice.
All this
These
is very
adventures in
interesting.
astronomy.
Yes, but for people in the 21st century, this is not very common because most people is detached from space.
Yeah, they are.
They don't they're sometimes not very interested in this. We are the nerds that say, oh look there's
Yeah,
this, and
yeah.
people are like, oh yeah,
And
okay.
people
Whatever.
think, and they don't think twice when they see a strange light in the sky, which they don't know. They don't know how to identify, and it's
Right.
basic planet, moon next to something, and they don't know. Oh, it's a satellite. They usually, it's just a satellite. No, it's not. It's a
No,
planet.
it's not. Well, it's a satellite in the sense that it's something moving around something else.
Well, yeah.
In that sense,
In
yes.
that sense,
yes.
it would be. Yeah.
But not the satellite you mean.
No.
So I think you have a great project in
Mhm.
your hands.
I'm hoping I can start working on it. I just need to set aside time and say, okay, this is the time I'm going to work on it. Because if I wait until I actually have time, I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah.
No, you just have to do it,
You have
yes.
to do it. Yeah.
So, but
understand.
will you begin? You said that you like to see how the ideas are transmitted. That's also what we do in our project. So, will you begin from, let's say, antiquity, and then go all the way to the
To the
contemporary times?
modern period is
Oh,
what
that
I would.
be very nice.
So the kind of my organization right now is having a little bit with pre-antiquity, so really old stuff
Mhm.
where we don't know as much, there's a lot more speculation, and then do more with antiquity, Greek and Roman, do Islam because I have to do Islam, and then Renaissance, and then move into after doing like Newton and his he basically destroys that disconnect between the earth and the heavens, and then move into the modern age and actually talk a little bit about like the quantum revolution and the expansion of the universe, just kind of to end with, this is where we are now, and what does that actually mean for our perceptions?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's,
And where do we go from here? That will be also interesting. Well, we cannot say. We don't know. That's very interesting.
Yes.
So I think that's it. That is a lot
Very
of
good
work
project.
and
Well,
very
good luck
interesting.
for project. We'll be attentively waiting for it.
Hopefully it happens before I die.
Yeah.
I get sucked into the black hole of determinism again.
Well, we are being pulled back again.
I can't get away from it.
So yes.
Yeah. Oh well, Teri.
I think we will stop now. Otherwise, we'll stay here
We'll
until
stay here
Christmas.
exactly.
Right.
And we will keep in touch. Thank you very much
Yeah.
for
Thank
talking
you very
to us.
much. It was a lovely conversation.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Enjoyed it very much also. And we will be in touch.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.